So far, we've looked at the language of argument in some detail because we've separated the reason markers from conclusion markers. And we've talked about assuring and guarding and discounting and evaluative words. So we've picked out a lot of different words in language that play distinct roles in arguments. But what we need to do for a real argument is to bring it all together and show how these types of words can work together in a single passage. And to do that, we're going to learn a method called close analysis. And what you do with close analysis is you simply take a passage and you mark the words in that passage that play those roles. So a reason marker you can mark with an R, and a conclusion marker you can mark with a C, a assuring term you mark with an A guarding term you mark with G, a discounting term you mark with D, an evaluative term you mark with E, and if it's clear you put a plus or a minus to indicate whether it's positive evaluation or negative evaluation. Now these marks will just be scratching the surface. There's obviously a lot more that you can do and need to do in order to fully understand the passage. So when it's a discounting term, you ought to think about which objection is being discounted. And you also ought to think about the rhetorical moves, the metaphors and irony. We'll look at rhetorical questions, and we'll basically go through the passage very carefully, word by word, in order to figure out what's going on in that passage. So, how do you learn the technique? The answer is very simple. You practice, and then you practice again, and then you practice and practice and practice and practice. Practice won't make perfect, because nothing's perfect. But practice will surely help a lot, and we'll get better and better the more we practice. So in this lecture, what we're going to do is go through one example in a lot of detail and mark it up very carefully in order to practice the method of close analysis. The particular example we chose for this lecture is by Robert Redford. It's an op-ed that was written for the Washington Post. We chose it because it's an interesting issue. It's about the environment, but it's not an issue that people will necessarily have very strong emotions about because you might not even know the particular part of the environment that he's talking about. We also chose it because it's a really good argument. You learn how to analyze arguments and how to formulate your own arguments by looking at good examples. Of course, it's fun to tear down bad examples, but we need a nice model of a good argument in order to see what's lacking in the arguments that are bad. So we're going to go through an example partly because it's actually a pretty good argument. We're also going to go through this passage because it's really thick with these argument words. So you'll see that we're marking a lot of different things, and we'll have to go through it paragraph by paragraph and sentence by sentence and word by word in great detail. This lecture will seem like it's looking at the passage with a microscope. And that's the point, to learn to analyze with a microscope the passages where people give arguments. Okay, so the first sentence says, just over a year ago, President Clinton created the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument to protect once and for all some of Utah's extraordinary Red Rock Canyon country. Word number one, just. Well, justice is a good thing, right? So that must be an evaluative word. No. One of the first lessons in close analysis is that simply because you have the word just doesn't mean you're talking about justice. When he says just over a year ago, he means slightly over a year ago, or somewhat over a year ago, or sometime over a year ago. So maybe he's guarding. You might want to mark this one as a guarding term by putting a G out there. But he's not using an evaluation. To say just over a year ago, well, why would he guard? Because he's not very precise. He's not going to say 17 days over a year ago. He's saying just over a year ago so that nobody will raise a question at this point. He does not want people raising questions this early in the op-ed. So let's keep going. Just over a year ago, President Clinton created the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument to protect once and for all some of the extraordinary Red Rock country. Okay? What about the word to? Might seem like not much because it's such a short word, but it's actually doing a lot of work there if you think about it. We actually, I think, should mark it as an argument marker of some sort. Is it a reason marker or is it a conclusion marker? We'll come back to that. But first, let's get clear that it's an argument marker of some sort. When he says that he created the monument to protect once and for all, he means in order to protect, because he wanted to protect once and for all some of that country. It's an explanation of why he created it. It's giving you the teleological explanation, which tells you the purpose for which he created it. So, the bit that comes out, protect once and for all some of the country, is the reason why he created it, that explains the conclusion that he did create it. So this is a reason marker. Now the next word, protect. Well, you might think that protect is a neutral word because, after all, protectionism is criticized by some people. But actually, to protect something is to keep it safe from harm, to keep it safe from bad things happening to it. So to explain what counts as protection and what doesn't count as protection, you have to cite what's good or bad. And that makes it an evaluative word. And in this case, protecting is a good thing, so it gets marked as E+. Okay, the next words are once and for all. What does once and for all do? Nothing. Some of these words are going to get marked as nothing whatsoever. Because once and for all doesn't guard, it says once and for all. It's the absolute limit. But the next word, some, now what does that do? That guards. It's saying that what's protected is not all of Utah's Red Rock country. It's only some of it. And it's important for him to guard that, because he wants to say later on, as we'll see, that there's lots of it outside the monument that's not getting protected. So he wants to guard it and say it's not all. That's going to be important to his argument. Now, Utah's pretty neutral. Unless you're from that state, then you love it, and you might say that's an evaluative word, but let's skip that group of people right now. Extraordinary. What about extraordinary? Is that an evaluative word? Might seem to be an evaluative word because clearly what Redford means is extraordinarily beautiful or extraordinarily good Red Rock country. But the word extraordinary doesn't say extraordinarily good. You can have things that are extraordinarily bad. To say it's extraordinary is to say it's out of the ordinary, and the Red Rock country might be extraordinarily ugly. So the word extraordinary itself is not by itself an evaluative word, so it should be marked as nothing. And Red Rock country also is going to be neutral. It's beautiful stuff, but simply to describe it as made out of red rock doesn't say that it's beautiful, even though we all know that it is. Just look at the picture. So, now we've finished a whole sentence. Isn't that great?
A whole sentence! All right!
And all we did was find 6 things to mark in that sentence. Well, 4 were marked and 2 were nothing, but it shows you that you can go through a single sentence and do a lot of analysis in order to figure out what's going on, and we're just getting started. Now let's move on to the second sentence. It starts, in response to plans of the Dutch company to mine coal, President Clinton used his authority to establish the new monument, and so on. Let's go to in response to. What does that tell you? It tells you that what's coming after it explains why President Clinton used his authority. It was a response to the plans of the Dutch company, which means that it's an explanation. Notice that the previous explanation says why Clinton wanted to do it in general. This explanation tells you why President Clinton did it at that particular time rather than earlier or later. It's because he was responding to particular plans by a particular company. So the in response to is an argument marker. Now, is it a reason marker or a conclusion marker? Well, the conclusion, the thing that's getting explained, is that Clinton used his authority. So this must be a reason or a premise marker. You can also put P for premise marker or R for reason marker. Now, in response to plans of the Dutch company Andelex to mine coal on the Kaiparowitz Plateau, President Clinton used his authority under the Antiquities Act to establish the new monument. Now, this is actually a pretty tricky one. We know that the plans of the company are the premise that explains the conclusion that Clinton used his authority. But what's the word under doing? Well, under means it's the Antiquities Act that gave him that authority, that explains why he had that authority and justified him in doing what he was doing, namely establishing the monument. So the word under suggests that there's another argument in the background here, that the Antiquities Act gives the president the authority to establish monuments, and President Clinton used that authority. So the Antiquities Act is, again, a premise, or, as I said, you can call it a reason marker, for the premise that the Antiquities Act gives the president that authority, and that justifies Clinton in using his authority or explains why he was able to establish the monument. And the word to also indicates that what comes after it is establishing the new monument. That's what he was trying to do. That also is an argument that explains why he did it. He had the authority, but you don't always exercise your authority, right? And so the point of exercising the authority, the reason why he exercised his authority, was to establish the new monument. Again, it might seem tricky to keep citing the word to as an argument marker, but think about it. You can substitute in order to, he used his authority in order to establish the new monument, or because he wanted to establish the new monument. And we learned a few lectures ago that if you can substitute another argument marker for this particular word, then that shows that in this case, the word to is getting used as an argument marker. In this case, the premise, because it's his wanting to establish the monument that explains why he used his authority. Okay? And here's a tricky one. What about the word authority? Well, that's a really tricky word, and sometimes it's not completely clear how you want to mark it, right? You might think that this word is getting used as a discounting word, namely answering a potential objection. Some people might say, he didn't have the authority to do that. But you might think it's a positive evaluation. Having authority is a good thing. And you might think that it's an argument marker because it's a reason why he would have the ability to set up the monument, namely that he had the authority. But it doesn't actually say openly any of those things, so I would probably mark that as a nothing, but I think it's better to just put a question mark, because sometimes words are not going to have one clear function or another. You know, we're doing our best to put them into these little bins of the different types of words, but sometimes they're not going to fall neatly into one or the other, and you just have to recognize that. Of course, when it comes to the quizzes, we're not going to ask you about those kinds of words, but it's worth knowing that they're there. Okay? Now, let's move on. Setting aside for protection what he described as some of the most remarkable land in the world. Again, what is that telling you? Setting aside for protection, that tells you why he used his authority to establish the monument. So again, we've got an implicit reason here, but notice there's just a space. There's no actual word that can be marked as an argument marker. But still, there is a separate argument here. He set it aside for the protection. That was why he established the monument. That's why he used his authority to establish the monument, if you want to include that part of the argument as well. Okay? For protection. Protection, again, that's going to be evaluative, right? Because to protect something is to keep it safe from harm. Harm is bad, so protecting it must be good. When you explain what protection is, you're going to need to use the words good and bad, as we saw in the first sentence. What about these little quotation marks? I love quotation marks. You got to watch out for them. what he described as some of the most remarkable land in the world. Why is Robert Redford quoting President Clinton and saying how Clinton described this land? Because if you're trying to convince Clinton and trying to convince the general public to try to convince Clinton, there's nothing better than quoting Clinton himself. I mean, after all, Clinton can't say, I'm not an authority, right? So those quotation marks and saying that he described it, that all amounts to assuring. He's assuring Clinton that that has to be true because, after all, you said it yourself. And then he says, I couldn't agree more. Well, that's a different type of assuring. Remember when we saw that some assuring terms were authoritative and other assuring terms were reflexive. Well, quoting President Clinton is an authoritative assurance. It's citing an authority. I couldn't agree more says how much he agrees or how much certainty he has. It certainly suggests. And so he seems to be assuring you, but on a different basis. Clinton and I both agree. We might disagree about other things, but we agree about this, which gives you some reason to be sure that it must be true. Next, for over 2 decades. The word for is sometimes an argument marker. Is it an argument marker here? No. How can you tell that? It's actually nothing here. But how can you tell that? Try substituting an argument marker. You can't say, because over 2 decades many have fought battle over battle. It's not because, it's just saying during that period. The term for and the words after it, over 2 decades, are simply being used to indicate time, not to indicate any kind of reason in this case, so it should be marked as nothing. Many have fought battle after battle. Is that a guarding term? Sometimes many is a guarding term. Instead of saying all, you say many. But here, you're saying many have fought battle after battle. Nobody thinks all have fought battle after battle to keep the mining conglomerates from despoiling the country. After all, the mining conglomerates themselves didn't, so it can't be all. So nobody would expect the word all. So in this case, the word many is not functioning to guard the term by weakening it, because it never started out as the strong claim all. There was nothing to weaken. They fought battle after battle. Well, you might think that battles are a bad thing, so you might mark that as E-, because after all, conflict is a bad thing, and in battles people get hurt and try to hurt each other. So to explain what a battle is, you need to introduce an evaluative word. And what did they fight those battles for? To keep mining conglomerates from despoiling the treasures, right? Again, to can be seen as in order to. That's why they fought the battle. It explains the battle. Or because they wanted to keep the mining conglomerates from despoiling the countries. So it looks like to there is indicating the premise in an argument that explains why they fought battle after battle. Okay? Mining conglomerates. Is mining bad? No. Are conglomerates bad? Not necessarily. You can explain what a conglomerate is without talking about good or bad. From despoiling. Now, wait a minute. Now we've got an evaluative term. It's an evaluative negative term. Despoiling means spoiling things or making them bad. And what about treasures? Treasures is going to be an evaluative plus term because treasures are good things. Now, the next word of the last sentence of this paragraph, just a temporal indicator, so that's nothing. We thought, okay? Thought means it's not really true. He's just guarding it. It's not really true that some of it was safe. We thought it was. Some of it was safe, or even at least some of it was safe. Now that's going to be a guarding term because it's not saying all of it was safe. It's just a little part of it, and that'll become important later in the argument. Whoa, look at this diagram. It's got letters all over the place, and they're running into each other. That shows you what close analysis does. When you start looking in detail, a lot of the different words are doing things that you can find out by trying to put them into these different categories. So, we've finished the first paragraph.
An entire paragraph! Oh my god!